Intro to the human body. So let's talk about what anatomy and physiology even is before we go on to a year-long course about the details of anatomy and physiology. So the terms anatomy and physiology each refer to the body, but different aspects of the body or different approaches to examining the body. Anatomy is stuff. What's there? What is it? Where is that thing? What does that thing look like? What is around that thing? So anatomy would be a description of the different parts of the body and their relationships to one another in space, within the body. Physiology is more like how it works. What does it do? What does it work with? You could also say, what could go wrong here as well. So if we're talking about the cardiovascular system, simply identifying the cardiovascular system, naming the organs, naming the blood vessels, naming the tissues that makes up the cardiovascular system, that makes up the heart, that makes up the blood vessels, what the names of everything is, what all the accessory structures within the heart are, that's all anatomy speak. Talking about the electrical process of how the heart beats, with your SA node stimulating your AV node stimulating a contraction of the heart muscle, the propulsion of blood through the ventricle and out through the blood vessels, the pressures involved, all of that is physiology stuff. Study of anatomy and physiology are complementary. It's pretty hard to study one without at least addressing the other. They go hand in hand. They're a yin and a yang. Knowledge of anatomy, though, can inform your knowledge of physiology. In other words, if you know what that thing is, that organ, that tissue, that structure, whatever, if you know what it is, where it is, what's around it, what makes it up, what types of cells, what types of tissues makes it up, you can use that information to deduce what it probably does and how it probably works. Form follows function. You've heard that expression in physics probably, or in design classes or architecture or whatever. It applies to the body as well. Your body is organized from small to large, just like everything else in the world. The simplest structures of the body are atoms. They're the simplest structures of everything in the universe. Atoms can organize themselves into molecules. Some can be very simple, like a water molecule, which is just two H's and an O, H2O. Some can be very, very large. They can be large aggregate macro structures. They can be very big proteins. DNA is an example of a molecule. You've got 6 feet of DNA packed into every single one of your cells. It's a lot of molecules. Those molecules, from small to large, will organize themselves or be organized into cells. The cell is the simplest level of organization in life. Atoms and molecules are not alive. Everything from here up is alive. If you break down a cell into its constituent parts, organelles, lipid bilayer, DNA, nucleus, ribosomes, none of those things are individually alive. Only once they come together within the context of a whole cell is it considered alive. The cell is the simplest level of organization in life. Now, you're a big organization of cells. You've got a lot of cells in you, and they're not just a random hodgepodge of cells, right? They're organized into certain structures by associating with one another by function and or by type of cell. When you have a group of tissues, or sorry, a group of cells lumped together, to put it inelegantly, by function, or type. That's called a tissue. You have a bunch of cells in a similar place, looking like the same thing, doing roughly the same thing, or working together towards a very specific common goal, is a tissue. We're going to have a whole lecture and a whole set of labs about the tissues themselves. This is really, when I talked about anatomy and physiology, form follows function. If you know the anatomy, you can deduce the physiology. This is a really important thing to examine. What tissues are there? How do cells lump themselves together? And how do they organize themselves in space? If you know those things, you can start to deduce what that organ does. A group of tissues combine to execute a specific task within the body. You have smooth muscle, connective tissue, epithelium that all come together into this big hollow balloon-like ball thing, and it holds urine. That organ is the urinary bladder. You've got cardiac muscle, epithelium, or endothelium, I should say more properly. It's enclosed in a sac. You've got fluid. You've got mesothelium. All of those together come, and you have electrical synapses. They're not quite nerves exactly, but they're electrical conduits within that muscle. All of those tissues and cellular organizational styles come together to make a functional heart. An organ system is an organization of, or a collaboration between different organs that come together to execute a major task of the body. So you've got, for the urinary system, for example, kidneys are one organ. You have ureters, which are those tubes that connect the kidneys to the bladder, urinary bladder. You have the urinary bladder, you have the urethra. All of these structures together help filter the blood and get any kind of waste product out of the blood. They help regulate blood pressure. They help regulate osmotic balance of the blood as well. The kidneys don't do that whole thing by itself. The ureters don't do that whole thing by itself. The urinary bladder doesn't do that whole thing by itself. They all have a role towards that common goal. But the group of organs that all work together towards a major goal is an organ system. And finally, you're an organism, a collaboration between a variety of organ systems and tissues that work harmoniously together with a system of checks and balances, creates a functional organism, something that can move about fairly independently throughout the world. I also like to add in biome to this, which would be like down here, a group of organisms. A group of organisms. We as human beings don't operate in a vacuum. We are part of communities. We are part of the public sphere. And as such, we are participants in the sphere of public health. If there's a virus going around, for example, it matters if I get the virus. My body will suffer if I get the virus, but I am not alone in that experience. I got that virus from another person or from another source, and I can pass that virus along to another person or another source. Our individual organisms are affected by the behaviors of the other organisms around us. In addition, we are host to biomes, microbiomes, inside of your respiratory system, inside of your digestive system, to a more limited extent in your reproductive and urinary systems, on the surface of your skin very abundantly. You are colonized by billions and billions of microorganisms, some of which depend on you specifically to live. Most of these organisms are not unique to you. Most of these organisms are benign to you. They're not beneficial, they're not detrimental, they just sort of live on you. In a sense, they're beneficial because they're going to sit on your skin or whatever, eat whatever has flaked off, and take up space. They can help crowd out bad things from encroaching. You do have bad bacteria, fungi, viruses, whatever, that are part of your microbiome. Hopefully they're kept in check by neutral things, and good things. You do have some good things. You have some microbiome elements, some microbiotic elements of bacteria and stuff that lives in your gut, for example, that you absolutely need in order to absorb and process certain vitamins. So not only are you part of a larger biome part of a larger community, and your participation influences other organisms within that biome, but you are also host to your own huge set of biomes in and of yourself. Let's talk about anatomy and how we look at anatomy. We can approach anatomy in two major ways. We can approach it from a gross perspective or a micro perspective. Gross anatomy refers to big stuff, looking at the whole organism or a whole organ or a whole tissue and characterizing it somehow. You're dissecting a cadaver, you're taking a biopsy of a heart, well, you're not really going to biopsy a heart so often, something else. You're taking a biopsy of your skin, let's say. These usually involve cutting into the tissue somehow with a surgical intervention. Dissection is any kind of cutting of tissue. And is not restricted to dead stuff. We usually use it in the context of dissecting dead things, but really when you're cutting through a person during surgery, you're dissecting away tissue. So living or dead. Also, we can examine gross anatomy by using different medical imaging technologies. You can step in front of an X-ray machine and see your bones as whole units or parts of bones. You can drink barium, step in front of that same X-ray and see the path of your digestive system. You can use an ultrasound to look at a fetus. This is all types of ways of examining from a gross anatomical perspective. Microscopy involves looking at smaller subunits, so tissues and individual cells. This necessarily requires some kind of microscope, a light microscope, a scanning electron microscope, whatever. But you need these things to look at the tissues and the cells to the degree necessary. I had already just mentioned the process of dissection involves cutting tissue. Again, not restricted to the dead. If you're dissecting away tissue in surgery, you're just cutting away tissue to find the thing that you're looking for in surgery. The suffix for cutting tissue is otomy. So if you're doing a laparotomy, this is cutting through the body to look for something. If you're doing a craniotomy, you're cutting into the skull. This isn't telling you anything else. These terms are only telling you that you're cutting into these structures to see things. If you're removing something, it's ectomy. So, appendectomy is the removal of the vermiform appendix. Hysterectomy is removal of the uterus. So ectomy is removal. You can do a laparotomy to remove the uterus, a laparotomy to do a hysterectomy. Laparotomy is cutting into the abdominopelvic cavity. Hysterectomy is the removal of the uterus. Ectomy usually requires otomy, but otomy doesn't necessarily require ectomy, if that makes sense. If you're doing a section or a surgical resection of something, what you're doing is cutting something away to reorganize. So if you're taking if you're resecting the bowel, what you're doing, if this is your length of bowel, you're cutting away the middle of it, and then you're going to stitch these two sides together. If you're doing a surgical section of a lung, you're going to cut away part of a lung to remove a diseased part of it. The rest of the lung will remain intact. You're not removing a whole anything, you're just removing a chunk of it so that you can help out that organ.